Hi, welcome to JDD TV. News, entertainment and music. Stay tuned as we explore Africa. Burkina Faso Ibrahim Traore. The demonstration around the world. For Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso. Remember to subscribe, like and share.
Has become the face of a new generation of African revolutionaries who are saying no more to Western interference on the continent. After taking power in Burkina Faso through a military coup in 2022, Traore did things that made the Western countries absolutely terrified. He kicked out French forces, he ended military cooperation with the former colonial power, he partnered with Russia, and most importantly, he has been vocal about African self-determination in a way that is stirring millions of people across the African diaspora worldwide. Unlike previous African leaders who played nice with former colonial powers, Traore openly calls out Western hypocrisy. He questions why Africa remains poor while its resources enrich European companies. He asks why African countries need permission from Paris to make their own decisions. This is not just politics, it is a generational awakening that is spreading like wildfire. This is why on the 30th of April 2025, something unexpected happened. What started as solidarity protests in Africa quickly spread to major cities across the United States, Europe, and everywhere Africans and their descendants call home. The protests were not just typical peaceful demonstrations. These were massive mobilizations that literally shut down major roads, brought traffic to a standstill, and forced the Trump administration to take notice in ways they never expected. But what exactly triggered these massive protests? The answer lies in a perfect storm of events that happened in late April 2025. First, there was an alleged coup attempt against Traore's government in Burkina Faso. Whether this was a real coup attempt or a manufactured crisis, one thing was clear. Western intelligence agencies' fingerprints were all over it. This is the same situation that has been seen in Libya, Syria, and countless other countries where leaders dared to challenge Western supremacy. But what came next was even more explosive. General Michael Langley, the head of AFRICOM, that is the U.S. Africa Command, made some absolutely outrageous comments during a Senate hearing that sent shockwaves across the African continent and diaspora communities worldwide. Langley claimed that Captain Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso was using the gold reserves just to protect the junta regime. He was essentially accusing Traore of stealing Burkina Faso's $4 billion 0 cents in gold reserves for his own personal security instead of using them to help the country's 22 million citizens. General Langley labeled Captain Ibrahim Traore as a threat to his own people.
They said they were going to save Libya. Today, let's go to Libya and compare Libya to that of when Omar Gaddafi was ruling Libya, and we'll find out the differences. Today, Libya is in tatters. Libya is going down. Right now that we have seen another leader in Africa rising up to serve the interests of the people, America is back again. If America wants to save somebody, they can go to South Sudan. If America wants to save somebody, they can go to Congo. If America indeed want to save themselves, they will be better off than they coming to save Burkina. No Burkina Bay is saying that they need their help and they should go out of Burkina. That's what we are saying.
The timing was no coincidence. These comments came just days after the alleged coup attempt, creating what many saw as a coordinated propaganda campaign to justify regime change in Burkina Faso. However, instead of staying silent while another African leader was potentially being targeted for regime change, the African diaspora said enough is enough. The protests were organized under the banner Hands Off AES, referring to the Alliance of Sahel States, which includes Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. All three countries have expelled French forces and are charting an independent path that has made Western powers absolutely furious. The most fascinating thing is how quickly these protests were organized. Within days of the alleged coup attempt, organizers across multiple continents had mobilized thousands of people. This was not some grassroots movement that took months to build. It was a coordinated response that demonstrated the power of global Pan-African solidarity in the digital age. The messaging was clear and firm. Leave Ibrahim Traore alone. Africa for Africans. These were not just slogans, they were battle cries for a generation of Africans who were tired of watching their continent being exploited by external powers. When these protests hit American cities, they did not just stay in designated protest zones or follow the typical script of American demonstrations. These protests were different. They were disruptive in ways that forced everyone to pay attention. In cities like Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, thousands of protesters took to the streets, but they did not just march, they occupied major intersections, shut down highways, and brought normal business to a complete halt. However, what made these protests particularly powerful was the diversity of participants. It was not just recent African immigrants. There were third and fourth generation African Americans, Caribbean Americans, and friends from various backgrounds, all united under this Pan-African banner. The chants were electric. Ibrahim Traore, our hero. Africa is rising. From Burkina Faso to the USA. Hands off Africa today. But most significantly, these protests tapped into broader frustrations about American foreign policy in Africa. For too long, the African diaspora in America has watched their ancestral continent be exploited, destabilized, and impoverished by the same Western powers that claim to champion democracy and human rights. The energy was unlike anything ever seen before. This was not just about supporting one leader, it was about African dignity, self-determination, and the right to chart their own course without external interference. Now, this is where the story gets absolutely fascinating. President Trump's reaction to these protests was unlike anything we have seen from him before. According to sources close to the administration, Trump was initially dismissive when his advisors briefed him about some African protests happening in American cities. But as the scale and intensity of the demonstrations became clear, his tone completely changed. Trump reportedly told his advisors during an emergency briefing that he could not believe it. What caught Trump off guard was not just the size of the protests, it was their effectiveness and organization. It was not just some random outburst that would fizzle out after a day. The protests were sustained, coordinated actions that demonstrated a level of political mobilization that even seasoned political operatives found impressive. Sources say Trump became increasingly agitated as he learned more about why so many people were rallying to support Ibrahim Traore. The idea that a young African military leader could inspire such loyalty and mobilization among Americans was something Trump had not anticipated. But something else really got under Trump's skin. The protesters were not just criticizing Burkina Faso's enemies, they were boldly calling out American foreign policy in Africa. Signs reading "Hands off Africa" were everywhere. For a president who prides himself on projecting strength and control, having American cities disrupted by protests supporting a foreign leader he could not control was deeply unsettling, and the way his administration responded said it all. Instead of the usual dismissive tweets or provocative rhetoric, there was an unusual silence from Trump's social media accounts about the protests. Behind the scenes, however, there was reportedly significant discussion about how to respond to this unexpected show of Pan-African solidarity on American soil. For decades, they have been used to conducting African policy with minimal domestic scrutiny or opposition. The African diaspora was largely disorganized and focused on other issues, but these protests changed that calculation entirely. State Department officials held emergency meetings to discuss how to respond to what they called unprecedented diaspora mobilization around African issues. The concern was not just about the protests themselves, it was about what they represented. Foreign policy experts who have spent their careers managing African affairs suddenly found themselves facing organized domestic opposition that understood the issues, had emotional investment in the outcomes, and possessed the organizational capacity to disrupt business as usual. Think tanks and policy organizations that typically operate in secrecy when discussing Africa found their events being protested, their experts being confronted, and their recommendations being challenged by informed, passionate activists. The Africa Society, Council on Foreign Relations, and other establishment organizations were forced to struggle with a level of public engagement on African issues they had never experienced before. We are not used to having passionate, organized constituencies weighing in on African policy, one former State Department official admitted. This changes everything. The protests also exposed something uncomfortable for the foreign policy establishment: the gap between America's stated values and its actual policies. And protesters chanted about supporting democracy while condemning American support for coup attempts, it highlighted contradictions that are usually buried in policy papers and diplomatic language. But were the protesters right to do so? Well, for decades, Western powers have maintained control over Africa through what is called neo-colonialism. There has been economic exploitation, political interference, and military intervention disguised as aid and partnership. France in particular has maintained an iron grip on its former colonies through the CFA franc currency system and military bases across the continent. But now, something fundamental is shifting. A new generation of African leaders is emerging who reject this neo-colonial arrangement entirely. This is not just happening in Burkina Faso. Mali and Niger have followed similar paths. Other African countries are watching closely and considering their own options. What the April 30th protests demonstrated is that this African awakening has a powerful diaspora component. The tens of millions of people of African descent living in the United States, Europe, and other Western countries are no longer passive observers of their ancestral continent's struggles. They are organized, they are mobilized, and they are willing to take disruptive actions to support African leaders who stand up to Western domination. This represents a fundamental shift in how African foreign policy will be conducted going forward. Western governments can no longer interfere in Africa without considering the domestic political consequences from their own African diaspora populations. But one of the most striking aspects of these massive protests was how little coverage they received from mainstream American media. Despite shutting down major highways, disrupting multiple American cities, and representing one of the largest Pan-African mobilizations in recent history, most major news outlets either ignored the protests entirely or gave them minimal coverage. CNN mentioned the protests briefly in a segment about foreign influence on American streets. MSNBC barely covered them at all. Fox News focused primarily on the traffic disruptions and foreign flags being waved on American soil. This media blackout was not accidental. The mainstream media has historically shown little interest in covering African affairs unless they involve disaster, conflict, or Western intervention. Positive stories about African agency, resistance to Western domination, or successful African leadership rarely make it into the news cycle. However, alternative media exploded with coverage. Independent journalists, African diaspora media outlets, and social media influencers provided extensive coverage that mainstream media ignored. YouTube channels, Instagram live streams, TikTok videos, and independent podcasts gave these protests the coverage they deserved. In many cases, the alternative coverage was more thorough and better informed than anything produced by mainstream outlets. Videos of the protests went viral on social media platforms, with hashtags like #HandsOffTraore and Africa Rising trending for days.